In the sun-baked wheat fields of Oklahoma, a storm is brewing that has nothing to do with the weather. When a gang of ruthless outlaws targets the Morrison family farm, they see it as just another soft mark in a string of violent raids. They couldn't have made a worse mistake. What they don't know is that James Morrison spent 20 years as Delta Force's most effective operator, with a reputation that made even hardened spec ops veterans whisper his name. His call sign was Reaper, not for his body count, but for how he could turn any terrain into a killing field. This isn't just another home invasion gone wrong. This is the story of how a band of violent predators learned they weren't the hunters, they were the prey. In less than 48 hours, one retired warrior would transform 500 acres of peaceful farmland into an elaborate trap, using nothing but agricultural tools, intimate knowledge of the land, and the lethal skills he'd prayed he'd never have to use again. The outlaws came looking for easy pickings, but they're about to learn what happens when you back a Delta Force veteran into a corner and threaten everything he loves. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dawn painted the Oklahoma sky in shades of amber and rose as James Morrison walked the perimeter of his wheat fields. His calloused hands brushed against the golden stalks, checking their readiness for the upcoming harvest. 20 years of military service had ingrained in him the habit of early rising, but these days his morning patrols served a different purpose. Instead of searching for insurgents or hidden IEDs, he monitored crop health and checked for signs of pest damage. The morning dew soaked through his work boots as he made his way back to the farmhouse, a century-old structure that he and Sarah had poured their savings into 5 years ago. The wraparound porch still needed some work, but the worn wood and slightly crooked steps felt more like home than any military base ever had. From the kitchen window, Sarah waved at him, her silver-streaked, dark hair caught in the morning light. She'd been a military wife for 15 years before they decided to chase this dream of rural peace. Now she taught English at the local high school, her passion for literature finally finding its outlet beyond the constant moves and uncertain schedules of military life. The screen door creaked open, and Emma stepped out onto the porch, her teenager's typical morning sluggishness evident in her movements. At 16, she was a perfect blend of her parents, Sarah's gentle intelligence and his own quiet determination. Her laptop was tucked under her arm, a constant companion as she worked on her college applications. Unlike many local kids who couldn't wait to take over their family farms, Emma dreamed of studying agricultural engineering, wanting to revolutionize farming practices while keeping one foot in the world she'd grown up in. "Dad, the irrigation system's acting up again in the south field," she called out, already pulling up the monitoring app she'd designed for their farm. The pressure dropped around 3 a.m. James nodded, suppressing a smile at her efficiency. He'd noticed the issue during his walk, but had wanted to see if she'd caught it too. Her system had proven more reliable than the expensive monitoring equipment most neighboring farms used. "Think you can help me take a look after breakfast?" Emma's face lit up. These morning repair sessions had become their special time together, where he could share his practical knowledge while she explained her latest technological innovations. She'd never know that he approached each repair with the same methodical attention he'd once given to weapons maintenance, or that he used these walks to teach her subtle lessons about checking sightlines and maintaining awareness of her surroundings. To two, aroma of coffee and bacon drew them inside, where Sarah had breakfast waiting. The kitchen, with its worn wooden table and mismatched chairs, was the heart of their home. Morning sunlight streamed through windows that James had methodically reinforced with hurricane-grade glass, a security measure he'd passed off as protection against Oklahoma's fierce storms. "The Sullivan farm got their new tractors yesterday," Sarah mentioned, sliding a plate of eggs in front of him. "Mary said they're having trouble with the computer systems." James caught the underlying message in his wife's casual comment. The Sullivans were their closest neighbors, 4 miles down the road, and any changes to their routine were worth noting. New equipment meant delivery trucks, unfamiliar faces, and altered patterns, all things that still triggered his professional instincts. "Might stop by later, see if they need a hand," he replied, meeting Sarah's knowing gaze. She understood his need to verify things personally, just as he understood her careful way of sharing information. Their years together had created a language of subtle signals and gentle redirections. Emma rolled her eyes at their exchange, though a smile played at her lips. "You two are worse than my friends with their secret emoji codes." She pulled out her phone, scrolling through messages. "By the way, there's another community meeting tonight about those break-ins up north. Ashley's dad says more farms got hit last week." James kept his expression neutral, but his mind was already cataloguing details. The string of farm robberies had been moving steadily southward, each incident more violent than the last. Local law enforcement seemed 2 steps behind, and the scattered nature of rural properties made response times dangerously slow. "Might be good to attend," he said carefully. "Keep up with the neighbors." What he didn't say was that he needed to gauge the community's level of preparation, to understand who might be ready to help if trouble came and who might need protecting. Sarah squeezed his shoulder as she refilled his coffee, her touch lingering for a moment. After 25 years together, she could read the subtle tension in his frame, the way his eyes flickered to the windows more frequently. She'd been his partner through countless deployments, understood the weight of responsibility he carried. "I was thinking of getting some extra canning done this weekend," she said lightly. Their code for stocking the basement storage room, ensuring they had supplies if they needed to hunker down. Emma looked up from her phone. "I can help. My new inventory app needs testing anyway." She'd inherited her father's gift for strategy, even if she applied it to databases instead of battlefields. James felt a surge of pride mixed with concern. His family was sharp, capable, and alert without letting fear rule their lives. They'd built something precious here, a real home, a place of growth and peace. But that old warrior part of him, the part he'd tried to bury under wheat fields and tractor repairs, whispered that peace was always fragile. Later, as he worked with Emma to fix the irrigation system, he watched her confidently diagnose the problem and propose solutions. The morning sun cast their shadows long across the field, and for a moment he allowed himself to hope that his combat skills would never be needed again, that his family could continue this gentle life they'd built. But 2 decades of combat experience had taught him that hope wasn't a strategy, so he kept his contingency plans updated, his hidden caches maintained, and his senses alert. Because sometimes the very things that made a life worth living were the things you had to be prepared to defend. The community meeting at Riverside High School's gymnasium felt more like a war council than a neighborhood gathering. James sat near the back, watching faces as Sheriff Cooper detailed the latest string of attacks. 3 farms hit in the past week alone, each raid more violent than the last. The Hendersons had been beaten even after giving up their safe combination. The Mackenzies' barn had been burned to the ground as a warning to others. "We're stretched thin," Cooper admitted, his weathered face grave under the fluorescent lights. "State police are helping where they can, but with properties so spread out—" He let the sentence hang, and James noted the mix of fear and frustration rippling through the crowd. Tom Sullivan, fresh from installing his new tractors, stood up. "What about the rumors these aren't just random hits? Word is, they're targeting specific farms, ones with good road access and minimal neighbors." The murmurs grew louder, and James filed away this detail. It matched his own analysis. These weren't opportunistic criminals, but a coordinated group, with tactical understanding, Back home that night, James pulled up the satellite view of their property on Emma's laptop. The Morrison farm sat at a dangerous sweet spot, close enough to Highway 44 for quick access, far enough from neighbors to prevent easy observation. Perfect for their peaceful lifestyle, but also perfect for less innocent purposes. Sarah found him still studying the maps hours later. Without a word, she placed a cup of coffee by his hand and sat beside him. Mary Sullivan said she saw an unmarked truck parked at Curtis Road yesterday, just watching the traffic. Her voice was calm, but her fingers worried at her wedding ring, a tell she'd never quite eliminated. Curtis Road gives a good view of all the farm approaches, James replied quietly. Good place to monitor patterns, track routines. He didn't need to explain further. Sarah had been married to him long enough to understand surveillance tactics. The next morning, James made a point of driving into town for supplies. At the general store, fragments of conversation painted a grim picture. Janet Miller's teenage son had spotted strangers photographing their grain silos. Old Pete Carson had found unfamiliar tire tracks cutting through his back field. Each incident minor enough to dismiss individually, but together they formed a pattern James had seen too many times before, the careful reconnaissance before an attack. He watched through the store window as an expensive black SUV with out-of-state plates cruised slowly down Main Street. The driver's posture screamed military or law enforcement training, but something felt off. James deliberately took his time, loading his truck, noting how the vehicle circled back twice, its tinted windows concealing the observer but not the observation. At the sheriff's office, Deputy Williams was more forthcoming than his boss had been at the meeting. Got reports of similar crews hitting farms in Texas and Kansas, the young officer confided. They're organized, professional. Some of the victims mentioned military-style tactics, hand signals, coordinated movements. James thanked him and left, his mind already gaming out scenarios. A crew with military training changed the equation significantly. They'd be familiar with standard response protocols, likely had counter-surveillance capabilities, probably had inside intelligence. The question was, how had they picked their targets? The answer came that afternoon when Emma burst through the door, her normally composed face flushed with worry. Dad, someone hacked the county agricultural database. Ashley's dad works in the assessor's office. He said they got into everything. Property maps, crop reports, financial records. James felt the familiar cold clarity settle over his mind. The enemy had their playbook, knew which farms were profitable, which had recently made equipment purchases, which had sold their harvest. Combined with physical surveillance, they could prioritize targets with surgical precision. Sarah watched him process this information, saw the subtle shift in his bearing. "I'll call the school," she said softly. "Take some personal days next week." Another code. She'd stay home, maintain a presence, keep their routine looking normal, while being ready to move at a moment's notice. That evening, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, the setting sun turning them into bruised purple mountains. James stood on the porch, watching lightning flicker in the distance. The air felt heavy with more than just approaching rain. Beside him, Emma's laptop chimed with another alert from her monitoring system. "Movement at the south fence line," she reported. "Probably just deer, but—" She trailed off as James raised his hand slightly, a gesture she'd never seen him use before, but instinctively understood meant silence. In the growing darkness, a flash of light, too brief to be lightning, too directional to be natural, blinked from the ridge near Curtis Road. A signal. James had seen enough. The storm wasn't just coming. It was already here. The Morrison family dinner table had always been a place of connection, but tonight it served as a subtle command center. Sarah's homemade lasagna steamed in its dish, while James walked Emma through her college applications, their conversation layered with deeper meaning than academic futures. UC Davis has an excellent agricultural program, Emma said, her laptop open beside her plate. Their security protocols are impressive too. The campus has multiple exit routes, and their cyber defense program is top tier. She glanced at her father, seeking approval not just for her college choice, but for her tactical thinking. James nodded, pride mixing with concern. His daughter had inherited more than just his analytical mind. She'd absorbed his way of evaluating environments, even if she applied it to different purposes. Good sightlines from the dormitories? He asked, only half joking. Sarah reached across the table, squeezing his hand. She gets it from both of us, you know. I didn't spend 20 years as a military wife without learning a thing or two about situational awareness. Her smile was warm, but her eyes held the same alert focus they'd had during his deployments. The familiar rhythm of family dinner was interrupted by the distant rumble of motorcycles on the main road. James caught Sarah's subtle head tilt. She'd counted 4 distinct engines. Emma's fingers paused on her keyboard, her face carefully neutral as she pulled up her property monitoring app. The new security cameras for the science lab came in today, she said casually, meaning her homemade surveillance system had detected something. Ms. Parker thinks they're overkill, but after the break-in at the chemistry storage last month, James maintained his relaxed posture while scanning the darkening windows. The motorcycles had passed without slowing, but he'd noted their deceleration pattern. They were mapping distances, marking landmarks. Those cameras might come in handy. Technology's always changing, have to adapt. Sarah stood to clear the plates, her movements deliberately unhurried. Speaking of adapting, I was thinking of rearranging the basement storage this weekend. The current layout isn't very efficient. Her words carried the weight of preparation. She wanted to ensure their backup supplies were properly organized. The familiar domesticity of the scene belied the undercurrent of tension. James watched. His family moved through their evening routine, each member playing their part in their well-practiced dance of vigilance. Emma's casual mention of network upgrades meant she was strengthening their communications. Sarah's comments about canning supplies translated to ammunition checks and medical kit updates. Later, as James helped Sarah with the dishes, they fell into the comfortable silence of a long-married couple. She handed him plates to dry, their movements synchronized by years of partnership. "Remember that time in Frankfurt?" she asked softly, "when you taught me how to pack a go bag like it was just regular luggage?" He did remember. It was early in their marriage, his first overseas posting. She'd been so young, but so determined to understand his world. "You color-coded everything. Most organized bug-out bag I'd ever seen." "Still is," she smiled, but her eyes were serious. "Emma's never had to use hers. I'd hoped she never would." The unspoken question hung between them. Had their pursuit of a peaceful life put their daughter in danger? "We've given her something worth protecting," James answered the unspoken doubt. "Not just survival skills, but a home, a purpose." He dried the last plate, watching through the window as Emma sat on the porch, her laptop casting a blue glow on her focused face. "She's stronger than we give her credit for." Sarah leaned into him, her head resting against his shoulder. "We all are. But I haven't missed how you check the perimeter twice as often now, how you've been testing the old radio equipment in the barn." "Force of habit," he said, but they both knew better. The soldier in him had never fully retired, had merely shifted focus from protecting his country to protecting his family. The skills were the same, the stakes even higher. The evening settled around them, crickets chirping their night song. Emma's monitoring system hummed quietly, her latest algorithms scanning for anomalies. Sarah's newly organized medical supplies waited in carefully labeled containers. James's hidden caches of weapons remained untouched but ready. They were a family built on love, but forged in the awareness that peace must sometimes be defended. As James looked at his wife and daughter, He saw not potential victims, but capable partners. Whatever storm was coming, they would face it together, each bringing their own strengths to the fight. The quiet evening felt precious, perhaps because they all sensed such moments might soon become rare, but there was strength in this too, in knowing that what they were protecting was real and worth any price to preserve. The change in the wheat field was imperceptible to anyone else, just a slight variance in how the stalks swayed in the pre-dawn breeze. But to James, it was like a neon sign. Someone had moved through here within the last hour, disturbing the natural pattern. He crouched, running his fingers over a broken stalk. The break was fresh, the wheat still moist where it had been snapped. Emma's early morning alert had been right. Her system had detected an anomaly in the thermal readings at the far edge of the property, something moving too deliberately to be wildlife. Now, as the first hints of sunrise painted the eastern sky, James tracked the intruder with the same methodical patience that had made him legendary in Delta Force. The trail led toward the old hunting blind, overlooking the farm's main access road. James moved silently through the wheat, his muscles remembering patterns of movement he'd hoped never to use again. The blind was the perfect observation post, elevated, concealed, with clear sightlines to the house and barn. Exactly where he would have set up surveillance. 20 yards out, he caught the glint of morning light on glass, a scope or camera lens. The observer was professional enough to minimize movement, but hadn't accounted for the angle of the rising sun. Amateur mistake, or perhaps not a mistake at all. This could be a test, probing for response. James circled wide, using the contours of the land for cover. The morning dew soaked his pants as he crawled the final stretch, but he remained focused on his target, one person in the blind, judging by the weight distribution on the platform. Armed, based on the shadow profile, he reached up and plucked a single stalk of wheat, calculating wind direction. With deliberate care, he removed a small pebble from his pocket, a habit from his morning walk that was about to prove useful. The throw was perfect, landing in the wheat 30 feet to the observer's left. The figure in the blind tensed, scope turning toward the sound. James was already moving, closing the distance with practiced silence. His hands found familiar points of contact. One on the observer's weapon, controlling its direction, the other securing a chokehold refined by years of close-quarters combat. "Quiet," he whispered, as the man began to struggle. "Your backup is too far away to help, and you really don't want to draw their attention right now." The pressure on the carotid artery was precise, and within seconds, the observer slumped unconscious. James quickly secured his prisoner with zip ties from the man's own gear. Another professional touch. The observer carried no identification, but his equipment told a story. High-end surveillance gear, a modified military-grade radio, and a phone with a sophisticated encryption app. Most telling was the satellite photo of the Morrison farm, with annotations marking lines of sight, approach routes, and potential security measures. They'd done their homework, but their intelligence was incomplete. The blueprints they'd obtained from county records didn't show the modifications James had made. The patrol patterns they'd mapped didn't account for Emma's sensor network. Most importantly, they'd drastically underestimated the capabilities of the man they were dealing with. James secured the unconscious observer in one of his prepared hidden spaces, a storm cellar off the old trail that didn't appear on any official documents. The man would be comfortable enough for a few hours, hidden from his companions, but safely contained, until James decided how to proceed. Walking back, he allowed himself a grim smile. They'd sent their scout in without backup, testing the waters. Now they'd have to deal with radio silence, wondering if their man had been compromised or was simply maintaining cover. It would force them to accelerate their timeline, make them sloppy. By the time he reached the house, Sarah was in the kitchen, preparing breakfast. She read the situation in his stance immediately. "Everything all right with the irrigation check?" she asked. "Their code for security sweeps." "Found a problem," he replied evenly. "Nothing I couldn't handle, but we might want to look at the other systems." Meaning, one threat neutralized, but be ready for more. She nodded, reaching for her phone, to text Emma, who was still upstairs. Their daughter would check her monitoring systems, looking for any other anomalies they might have missed. The family's response was smooth, practiced, each member knowing their role without need for explanation. James watched the sun rise fully over his wheat fields, knowing that somewhere out there people were waiting for a report that wouldn't come. The peace of his farming life had been an illusion, but maybe that was fitting. After all, fields of grain had concealed armies since ancient times. His farm was about to become a battlefield, and he had already drawn first blood. The old barn held more than farm equipment. Behind a false wall panel that Emma had helped him motorize for your bad shoulder, Dad, James accessed a cache he'd hoped would stay buried. The familiar weight of his modified M4 carbine settled into his hands as he began his inventory. Weapons were only part of it. He had communications gear, night vision equipment, and enough tactical gear to outfit a small team. His prisoner in the storm cellar had confirmed his suspicions. The gang was 12 strong, all with military or law enforcement backgrounds. They'd hit the Morrison farm within 48 hours, using their standard pattern of overwhelming force and speed. But James had something they didn't: intimate knowledge of every inch of his land, and 5 years of preparations they knew nothing about. The irrigation pipes became impromptu foxholes, pre-positioned at key defensive points under the guise of routine maintenance. The grain silo's upper platform, supposedly automated with Emma's tech, now housed a sniper's nest with commanding views of all approaches. Every tractor and piece of heavy equipment was positioned to provide cover or become an obstacle. Sarah found him rigging the barn doors with sensors salvaged from their old security system. Emma's morning scan picked up 3 vehicles on the back county road, she reported, helping him conceal the wiring. 2 SUVs and a cargo van. They're staying just outside her detection range. James nodded, trusting his daughter's technology. She designed her system to track anything larger than a coyote moving across their property, using a network of repurposed wildlife cameras and motion sensors disguised as agricultural monitors. "They're establishing a cordon," he explained. "Standard procedure. Isolate the target before moving in." "The root cellar is stocked," Sarah continued, her voice steady. "First aid supplies, water, enough food for 2 weeks. Emma's set up her backup router down there too. We'll have communications, even if they cut the main lines." The afternoon sun cast long shadows as James walked his perimeter one final time. Each strategic point had been prepared while maintaining the appearance of normal farm work. Fertilizer. Bags filled with sand created bulletproof positions. Spare tractor parts became impromptu barricades. The irrigation system could now be remotely controlled to turn sections of the farm into impassable mud at a moment's notice. In the storm cellar, his prisoner was beginning to piece things together. "You're not just some farmer," the man said, as James brought him water. "The way you moved, the setup here, your military, special ops." "I'm a man protecting his family," James replied, checking the restraints. "That's all you need to know." But he studied the man's reactions, noting the growing uncertainty in his eyes. Good. Let him wonder. Let that doubt spread to his teammates when they finally found him. The sun was setting when James finished his preparations. From the outside, the Morrison farm looked unchanged, peaceful, productive, vulnerable. Only his family knew that every approach had been accounted for, every angle covered, every apparent weakness turned into a potential trap. Sarah watched him clean up for dinner, her eyes catching the subtle changes in his demeanor. The farmer was fading, the warrior emerging. "We knew this life might come with a price," she said softly. "I just thought we'd have more time." James pulled her close, feeling the tension in her shoulders. "Time's something we're about to make them waste a lot of," he promised. The calm in his voice wasn't forced. He was in his element now, the familiar clarity of combat preparation settling over him like an old friend. As darkness fell, the Morrison family sat down to what might be their last peaceful dinner for a while. Through the window, the wheat fields swayed gently in the evening breeze, concealing their newly lethal purpose. The war was coming to their doorstep, but James had spent 5 years turning his sanctuary into a fortress. Soon, his enemies would learn that the hard way. Morning arrived with an unsettling stillness. James stood in the kitchen, watching Sarah pack what appeared to be a normal shopping list into her bag. They both knew it was anything but routine. "The grocery store first," he said quietly. "Then the hardware store. Take your time. Make it look natural." What he didn't say was, "Stay away until I signal it's safe." Emma hugged him tightly before leaving, slipping a small earpiece into his hand. "It connects to the backup system," she whispered. "I can warn you if anything triggers the perimeter alerts." Her voice wavered slightly, but her eyes were steady. In that moment, she looked so much like Sarah during his early deployments, scared but refusing to show it. "I'll be monitoring everything," she added, tapping her laptop bag. "Mum's phone is linked to the emergency channel. If anything happens—" She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. James cupped her face in his hands. "Hey, remember what I taught you?" "Awareness over fear," she recited. "Plan beats panic. That's my girl." He kissed her forehead, then stepped back to address them both. 3 hours. If you haven't heard from me by then, implement Protocol Echo." Their emergency plan. New identities, new location, everything they'd hoped they'd never need. Sarah's hand lingered on his chest, a lifetime of unspoken words passing between them. "Come back to us," she said simply, then led Emma to the car. James watched them drive away, memorizing the sight of his family until their vehicle disappeared down the dusty road. The moment they were gone, he moved with focused precision. The prisoners' intel had been valuable. The gang would attack from multiple directions, using the cover of the wheat fields. They expected a quick operation, overwhelm any resistance, secure the family as leverage, take what they wanted. Standard smash-and-grab tactics that had worked on other farms, but the Morrison farm was about to give them a harsh education in asymmetric warfare. James began his final preparations, muscle memory from countless missions taking over. The weight of his tactical vest felt familiar under his workshirt. Each weapon was checked and positioned for quick access. Communication channels were verified, backup plans confirmed. His mind drifted to an operation in Kandahar, where his 6-man team had held off nearly 50 insurgents. The key hadn't been firepower, it had been preparation, position, and the willingness to let the enemy make the first mistake. The same principles would apply here. A distant drone of vehicles caught his attention, right on schedule. Emma's voice crackled in his earpiece. "Dad! 3 trucks just turned onto Curtis Road. Heavy engine sounds, probably armored." A pause then. More vehicles approaching from the South Access Road. "Good girl," he murmured. "Keep monitoring but maintain radio discipline from now on." He moved to his first position, noting how the morning sun cast shadows across his prepared, firing lanes. The irrigation system was primed to turn key areas into muddy traps. Agricultural equipment was positioned to channel any approaching vehicles exactly where he wanted them. Years of combat experience had taught him that the moments before an engagement were crucial. He used these final minutes to center himself, running through the terrain modifications he'd made. The hay bales reinforced with steel plates, the grain silo rigged with remote-activated floodlights to destroy night vision effectiveness, the carefully planned escape routes and rally points. In his earpiece, Emma's breathing was steady as she monitored her systems. She was scared but focused, just like he'd taught her. Sarah would be keeping up appearances in town, maintaining their cover story while being ready to implement emergency protocols if needed. His family was ready. His farm was ready. A glint of light from the tree line caught his eye. A sniper setting up, not quite careful enough to avoid detection. James allowed himself a grim smile. Time to remind these people why his old unit had called him Reaper. They thought they were hunting a simple farmer. Instead, they'd walked into a trap 5 years in the making. The wheat fields swayed peacefully in the morning breeze, concealing their lethal modifications. Soon, those same fields would become his killing ground. James settled into position, his breathing slow and steady. The calm before the storm was ending. The war for his farm was about to begin. The first sign of the advance team came as a subtle disturbance in the wheat field's natural movement. 3 men, moving in a standard tactical formation, approaching from the northwest. Their camouflage was professional grade, their movements disciplined, but they were fighting blind while James watched their every move through the thermal scope he'd mounted years ago under the guise of wildlife observation. "Dad," Emma's voice whispered in his earpiece, motion sensors picking up 2 more approaching the barn from the east. She'd inherited his calm under pressure, her voice steady despite the stakes. James keyed his mic once in acknowledgement. Silence was now his greatest ally. The advance team was doing exactly what he'd expected, probing his defenses, looking for resistance before the main force committed. Standard operating procedure for professionals, also predictable. He watched the first team reach his initial trigger point. With practiced ease, he activated the irrigation system for Section 3. Water began flooding the carefully graded terrain, turning packed soil into treacherous mud. The effect was immediate. The point man slipped, his gear clanking softly. As he fought for balance, the sound was enough. In the barn, the motion sensors they'd triggered activated the ventilation fans, industrial-sized units that Sarah had insisted on for proper grain storage. The sudden noise masked the team's communication, disorienting them further. James moved silently through his prepared routes, covered positions he'd spent years establishing under the guise of agricultural necessity. The East team was better. They'd spotted the trip sensors near the barn and were working to bypass them, but they hadn't noticed the real threat. The grain auger's loading chute, now repurposed as a perfect firing position. The first shot came from the enemy. A sniper round cracked past his position, striking the metal silo with a sharp ping. Good placement, but wrong position. They were shooting at where they thought he should be, not where he was. 2 vehicles just turned onto the access road, Emma reported. Heavy engine sounds. "Dad, I think they have a tactical truck." Time to make a statement. James reached for the agricultural drone controller, one of Emma's projects that the county had approved for crop monitoring. The small drone rose from its hiding place, its cameras providing a perfect view of the approaching vehicles. The advance team spotted it immediately, but too late. James had already seen what he needed. The tactical truck was armored, but top-heavy. Perfect. He triggered the irrigation cells along the access road's hidden slope. Thousands of gallons of water turned the packed dirt into a slick trap. The truck's driver spotted the hazard and tried to brake. Physics took over. 8 tons of armored vehicle began to slide, turning sideways as it left the road. The crash wasn't catastrophic, but it effectively blocked the easiest approach to the farm. Now for the advance teams, they'd tightened formation. After the truck incident, falling back to covered positions. Professional, cautious, but they'd bunched up exactly where he wanted them. James triggered the repurposed fertilizer spreader he'd positioned the day before. A carefully measured cloud of agricultural lime dust filled the air, non-toxic but dense enough to ruin night vision equipment and thermal optics. In the confusion, he made his move. The first man never saw him coming. A quick strike to the base of the skull, and one threat was neutralized. The second spun at the sound, but James was already moving. A precise leg sweep, followed by a chokehold, clean, quiet, efficient. The third showed why they'd sent him in first. He managed to get off 2 shots, both going wide, as James used his own teammate's unconscious body for cover. Then they were in close quarters combat, the kind James had mastered in decades of special operations. It ended quickly. 3 unconscious men, their weapons and equipment now adding to his resources. He secured them efficiently, using their own restraints, then moved them to his prepared holding area. They'd wake up with headaches, but no permanent damage. A message to their leaders. "Emma, status," he whispered, returning to cover. 2 more vehicles holding position on Curtis Road, she replied. Wait, they're pulling back. I think they're regrouping." James allowed himself a grim smile. Round 1 had gone his way. The enemy had just learned this wasn't going to be another simple farm raid. They'd come expecting to find an aging farmer and his family. Instead, they'd run headfirst into a delta. Force veteran fighting on ground he'd spent years preparing, but he knew this was just the beginning. They'd return with better intel, more men, and a healthy respect for what they were facing. The real battle was still to come. He checked his watch. Sarah and Emma would be maintaining their cover in town, waiting for his signal. He had time to prepare his next surprise. These people had threatened his family, his home, his peace. Now they'd learn why even his old Delta Force teammates had feared the call sign Reaper. The morning sun climbed higher, drying the mud he'd created. In the distance, he could hear vehicles retreating, but he didn't relax. The calm was deceptive. Like the fields around him, it would soon be broken by the next wave of violence. The war for Morrison Farm was just beginning. The gang's response came with the subtlety of a thunderstorm. Multiple vehicles approached simultaneously from 3 directions, their engines roaring in the late morning air. No more stealth, no more probing attacks. They'd shifted to overwhelming force. 6 vehicles total, Emma's voice crackled in his earpiece. They've split into 3 teams. Dad, they're carrying heavy weapons. I can see rifle barrels and what looks like... Her voice caught. I think those are grenade launchers. James's mind raced through scenarios. The enemy had adapted quickly, bringing enough firepower to level the farm. They'd learned from their first failure and were done playing games. Stay on monitoring, he told Emma, but get clear of town if... The rest of his instruction was cut off by the sound of approaching tires on gravel. His heart stopped as he recognized the distinctive rattle of Sarah's SUV. Through his scope, he watched in horror as his wife's vehicle sped up the farm's main access road, Emma in the passenger seat. Multiple bogies converging on your position. Emma's voice was tight with fear. Mum's trying to get us home before... The first shots cracked across the farm, the gang clearly spotting the approaching vehicle. Sarah swerved, her defensive driving training kicking in as she expertly maneuvered toward the barn. James was already moving, triggering prepared defenses to cover their approach. The irrigation system sprang to life, creating a wall of spray that obscured vision along the eastern approach. Solar-powered flood lamps, disguised as agricultural sensors, blazed to life, disrupting the gunman's aim. But it wouldn't hold them. For long, Sarah wheeled the SUV behind the barn just as the first grenade detonated, sending a plume of dirt skyward where they'd been moments before. James reached them as they scrambled from the vehicle, his fury matching his fear. Roads were blocked behind us, Sarah explained quickly, her teacher's bag clutched in one hand, a concealed pistol visible in the other. They were herding everyone away from the area. We had to watch out. Her warning came just as a burst of automatic fire stitched across the barn wall. James pulled them behind a reinforced hay bale, his mind already adjusting plans. Having his family here changed everything. More vulnerabilities, but also more resources. Emma had her laptop out, fingers flying across the keyboard. They've cut cell service, but my backup systems are online, linking to the surveillance grid now. Her voice was steady despite the chaos. Dad, they're deploying in a standard pincer movement. Another explosion rocked the ground, closer this time. They were using the grenades to probe his defenses, looking for hardened positions. Time to show them the meaning of prepared ground. Get to the basement, he ordered, handing Sarah the key to the gun safe hidden there. Emergency Protocol 3. She nodded, understanding immediately. They'd drilled this, even if they'd hoped never to use it. But, Emma started to protest. Need you on cameras and coordination, James cut her off. You're my eyes. Sarah, your security. I'll delay them. The years of practice paid off, as his family moved with practiced efficiency, staying low as they made their way to the concealed entrance. Once they were secure, James moved to his first prepared position. Through his scope, he counted at least 15 men advancing through. His wheat fields, their formation was good, but they didn't understand the ground they were fighting on. Time to educate them. He triggered the next set of defenses. Hidden speakers, part of Emma's agricultural automation system, suddenly blasted recorded farm equipment noise from multiple directions. Disorienting, masking the sound of movement. In the confusion, he took his first shots. 2 men down before they realized what was happening. Non-lethal shots, knees, shoulders. He wasn't trying to kill them. He was showing them the cost of their choices. Dad! Emma's voice was urgent in his ear. 3 men trying to flank around the silos, and something's wrong. The police band is active. Someone called in the gunfire. James cursed silently. Local law enforcement involvement would complicate things exponentially. But first, he had to deal with the immediate threat. The men by the silo were about to learn why he'd spent so much time on the irrigation system's pressure settings. The fight for his farm was no longer just about protecting property. With his family in the line of fire, the stakes had risen dramatically. These men had come expecting to overwhelm a simple farmer. Instead, they'd walked into the killing ground of a man who'd spent decades learning how to win impossible fights, and he was just getting started. The basement of the Morrison farmhouse had long since ceased to be just a storage space. Under Sarah's meticulous organization, it had become a combination of command center and fortress, steel reinforcement hidden behind rustic wooden panels, military-grade communications equipment disguised as old farm tools, a medical station tucked behind preserves and canning supplies. 2 teams moving up the East Ridge, Emma reported from her workstation, multiple screens showing feeds from her hidden cameras. They're using the irrigation ditches for cover. Her laptop was connected to a backup power supply, another of her innovative additions to their defenses. Sarah moved between defensive positions, checking ammunition stores and communications equipment. Years of being a military wife had taught her to channel fear into action. James, they're setting up some kind of heavy weapon near the old tractor. Through his rifle scope, James confirmed her observation. They'd brought a belt-fed machine gun, probably intended to pin him down while assault teams moved in. Amateur move. They still thought he was operating alone. Hadn't realized the farmhouse itself was watching their every move. Emma, initialize sonic defense protocol, he commanded, using their family code. His daughter's fingers flew across her keyboard, and suddenly the farm's hidden speaker system, officially registered as an agricultural bird deterrent, came to life. The supersonic pulses were specifically designed to disorient without causing permanent damage. The effect was immediate. The machine gun team's coordination faltered as the disorienting frequencies hit them. James used the opportunity to trigger another irrigation sequence, turning their position into a mud pit. Expensive military equipment meant nothing when you couldn't keep your footing. Movement at the grain silo, Sarah reported, watching another screen. They're trying to get an elevated position. She was already moving to a gun port, disguised as a ventilation duct, her teacher's steady hands wrapped around one of their pre-positioned rifles. James allowed himself a moment of pride. His family wasn't just surviving, they were fighting back, each member playing to their strengths: Emma's technical expertise, Sarah's steady precision, his tactical experience. Together, they were turning their home into a death trap for anyone foolish enough to breach it. "Dad!" Emma's warning came just as the first RPG streaked toward the barn. The explosion was impressive, but ultimately wasteful. The barn's reinforced structure, hidden beneath its weathered exterior, easily absorbed the impact. More importantly, they just revealed another weapons position. "Switching to thermal on Sector 4, Emma announced, her system tracking the heat signature of the RPG team. They're regrouping behind the equipment shed, 3 men, 2 more moving to support. James keyed his radio, knowing the enemy would pick up the transmission. "Last chance," he broadcast. "You've lost 6 men, with nothing to show for it. Cut your losses." The only response was another burst of gunfire, this time targeting the house's upper windows. Sarah's shot cracked out in response, precise and measured. A pained cry from the direction of the equipment shed confirmed her accuracy. "Shoulder shot," she reported calmly. "He's out of the fight, but alive." The attack was becoming more coordinated, teams moving in alternating patterns, trying to overwhelm their defenses through sheer numbers. But numbers meant nothing against preparation and intimate knowledge of the terrain. Every approach to the house was covered, every apparent weakness masking a trap. Emma's early warning system chirped. Vehicle approaching from the county road. Police markings, but she trailed off, enhancing the image. "Dad, that's not a regular patrol car." James quickly scanned the vehicle through his scope. The car was local police, but the driving pattern was all wrong. "They're involved," he concluded grimly. "Probably been feeding information to these guys all along." Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place, how the gang had known which farms to hit, why law enforcement response had always been too late. "New plan," he announced, his mind already adapting to the revelation. "Emma, activate Protocol Echo Charlie. Sarah, get the backup documents ready." His family moved without question, trusting his judgment. Protocol Echo Charlie was one of their most extreme contingencies, designed for when they couldn't trust any official channels. A fresh barrage of gunfire peppered the house's exterior, but James barely noticed. His focus was already on the next phase. These people had brought the war to his family, corrupted local law enforcement, and threatened everything he'd built. Time to show them why Delta Force operators were considered the most dangerous soldiers on Earth. The Morrison farm was about to become more than just a fortress. It was about to become a lesson in why you should never corner a man who spent his life studying how to win unwinnable fights. Dusk settled over the farm like a shroud, bringing with it a dangerous new phase of the battle. The attackers had pulled back to regroup, leaving their wounded to be collected under the cover of darkness. They thought night would give them the advantage. They were wrong. Thermal imaging shows 5 teams of 2 spread out in a containment formation. Emma whispered into the comm system. She'd modified her surveillance grid to work better at night, the infrared cameras tracking every movement across their property. "They're setting up portable lights. Looks like they're planning to flood the approaches with illumination." James moved like a ghost through the wheat fields, decades of night operations guiding his steps. The weight of his combat gear felt natural now, the farmer's disguise fully shed. In his ear, Sarah's calm voice tracked his movements against Emma's surveillance grid. 2 tangos approaching your 3 o'clock, she murmured. They're carrying night vision gear. Her position in the reinforced basement gave her access to all of Emma's feeds, allowing her to coordinate James's movements with surgical precision. James froze, becoming one with the darkness. The enemy pair passed within feet of his position, their confidence in their equipment betraying them. They were using military-grade night vision, but hadn't accounted for Emma's infrared strobes, disguised as normal farm security lights. They were programmed to pulse at a frequency that played havoc with night vision equipment. The first man went down silently, a precise strike to the brainstem, dropping him before he could make a sound. His partner spun at the whisper of movement, but James was already inside his guard. A quick grapple, a practiced chokehold, and another threat was neutralized. "Dad, they're setting up something big near the south fence." Emma's voice held a note of concern. "Thermal signature suggests a generator, and they're unloading more gear from the trucks." James secured his unconscious opponents, his mind racing through possibilities. A generator meant they were preparing for a sustained operation. They'd learned from their daytime failures and were settling in for a siege. "Movement at the edge of the camera grid," Sarah reported. 3 vehicles approaching from the county line. No headlights. "Local police band is active," Emma added, her fingers flying across her keyboard. "They're coordinating with—" "Wait. Dad, I've got something. They're using encrypted channels, but one of them messed up. Switch to an open frequency for a second." She paused, and James could hear the mix of fear and anger in her voice. "They're calling in private contractors, ex-military types." James processed this information as he moved to his next position. The stakes were escalating. Local law enforcement wasn't just looking the other way. They were actively supporting the operation, bringing in heavy hitters to finish the job. A flash of movement caught his eye. One of the teams had reached the irrigation control station, likely planning to cut off his water supply. They'd finally figured out how he'd been using the farm's systems against them. But they hadn't found the backup controls Emma had installed in the barn's sub-basement. "Sarah, initiate sequence Delta," he whispered. Across the farm, carefully hidden speakers began emitting low-frequency sound waves. Not enough to be obviously noticeable, but sufficient to induce unease and disorientation in anyone who wasn't expecting them. The effect on the attackers was subtle, but significant. Their movements became less coordinated, their sweeping patterns less precise. Fear began working in James's favor, each shadow potentially hiding the farmer who'd so thoroughly disrupted their supposedly simple operation. "New thermal signatures approaching from the east," Emma reported. "Different movement pattern from the others. More disciplined. These must be the contractors." James allowed himself a grim smile in the darkness. Professional contractors meant better training, better equipment, and bigger egos. They'd be determined to succeed where the others had failed, which would make them predictable. "Emma, implement. Prairie fire protocol," he instructed. Across the farm, hidden emitters began releasing a specialized combination of agricultural chemicals, harmless but disorienting, designed to make night vision equipment worse than useless. "James," Sarah's voice held a warning note, "they're spreading out for something big. This isn't just about the farm anymore, is it?" "No," he replied softly, watching the new teams move into position. "They can't afford to fail now. Too many witnesses, too many questions." He checked his equipment one last time. "Which means we can't afford to hold back anymore." The night stretched out before him, full of threats and opportunities. The enemy thought darkness would be their ally. Time to remind them why his old unit had specialized in night operations. Why the name Reaper had struck fear into hardened fighters across 3 continents. The real hunt was about to begin. The basement command center hummed with tension as James reunited with his family for a brief tactical pause. Emma's screens cast a blue glow across their faces, while Sarah laid out the documents she'd retrieved from their hidden safe. The evidence. They'd gathered painted a disturbing picture. "It's not just our farm," Emma explained, pulling up intercepted communications on her laptop. "The police chief, the county assessor, even some state officials, they're all involved. These raids aren't random, they're systematic land grabs." Her fingers traced patterns across the screen. "They target farms with strategic value, properties they can use to... Dad, I think they're setting up trafficking routes." James studied the map she'd compiled, his tactical mind seeing the bigger picture. Their farm sat at a crucial junction, offering multiple hidden approaches to the state line. The perfect distribution hub for illegal operations, especially with corrupt law enforcement providing cover. "We've got company," Sarah interrupted, watching the surveillance feeds. 3 SUVs just turned onto the main road. Different approach. Pattern from the others. She zoomed in on the vehicles. "Government plates. Federal task force," James confirmed, recognizing the formation. "Question is, are they here to help, or are they compromised too?" Emma's hands flew across her keyboard, accessing databases that officially didn't exist. Cross-referencing plate numbers. "Dad, these are DEA. There's been an ongoing investigation into corruption in the county. They must have picked up on the firefight." The family exchanged looks, weighing their options. They had enough evidence to expose the entire operation, but revealing it meant stepping into an even bigger fight. One that wouldn't end with just defending their farm. "We could still implement Protocol Echo," Sarah said quietly. "Disappear. Start fresh somewhere else." The documents in front of her included new identities, carefully prepared over years of contingency planning. James watched his daughter's face as she processed the surveillance data, saw the same determination he'd carried into countless missions. "Emma, your call too." She looked up from her screens, jaws set. "These people, they're not just stealing farms. They're destroying lives, corrupting everything they touch." Her voice steadied. "We can stop them. We have to stop them." Sarah reached for her husband's hand. "If we do this, we go all in. No half measures." James nodded, feeling the familiar clarity of a mission taking shape. "Emma, can you get a secure channel to the DEA team?" "Already on it," she replied, fingers dancing across the keyboard. "Routing through 3 layers of encryption. There. Channel's open." "Wait," Sarah interrupted, studying one of the screens. "Movement in Sector 7. The contractors are mobilizing. They must have spotted the federal agents." She zoomed in on thermal images of men rapidly deploying into attack positions. "They're not going to let law enforcement reach the farm." James checked his gear, mind already formulating plans. "They'll try to create a crisis, make it look like a civilian incident gone wrong, blame it on local violence, cover their tracks in the confusion." He turned to his family. Last chance to back out. Emma's response was to pull up a new set of tactical displays showing every approach to the farm. "I've got overrides ready for all systems, full offensive capabilities." Sarah moved to the weapons locker, her movements precise and practiced. "The DEA team will need a clear path to the farm. I can provide cover from the grain silo's upper position." Looking at his wife and daughter, James saw not the family he needed to protect, but the teammates he needed to complete the mission. They'd crossed a line. This was no longer just about defending their home. They were taking the offensive against a corrupt system that had underestimated the strength of a family pushed too far. "Emma, send a burst transmission to the DEA team. Give them our tactical frequency, but no other identification yet." He checked his weapons one last time. "Sarah, get into position but hold your fire unless absolutely necessary. We need witnesses for what's about to happen." The decision was made. The Morrison family was about to transform their defensive stand into a calculated offensive. The corrupt forces arrayed against them had thought they were simply clearing out an inconvenient farmer. Instead, they'd triggered the first phase of their own destruction. James moved toward the basement exit, his mind already gaming out scenarios. Behind him, Emma's systems hummed with deadly purpose, while Sarah took up her shooting position. They'd made their choice. Now it was time to show their enemies the full consequence of that decision. The betrayal hit like a physical blow. On Emma's main screen, the security footage played with brutal clarity. Deputy Chief Williams, their trusted contact in the sheriff's department, was coordinating with the contractors. The same man who'd shared intelligence about farm raids was now directing teams to surround the Morrison property. He was feeding us selective information, James analyzed, watching Williams gesture toward a tactical map. Keeping us focused on random gangs while they positioned their real forces. His jaw tightened as he recognized other faces in the footage. That's why they let us spot their surveillance. They wanted us preparing for the wrong threat. Emma's fingers flew across multiple keyboards, pulling up archived footage. It's worse, Dad. Look at these timestamps. She highlighted several clips showing Williams making late-night visits to their farm's perimeter over the past month. He wasn't just gathering intel, he was mapping our security measures. James. Sarah's voice cut through their analysis, sharp, with urgency. The DEA teams have stopped advancing. They're pulling back. Her scope remained trained on the approaching forces, but her voice carried the weight of understanding. Williams must have credentials that check out. He's convincing them this is a legitimate operation. The pieces fell into place with devastating clarity. This wasn't just about land grabs or trafficking routes. This was about systematic corruption, about power structures so entrenched they could turn federal agents away from a civilian firefight. Multiple vehicles approaching from the north, Emma reported, her voice tight. Dad, those are state police tactical units. Williams has them convinced we're the threat. Her screens showed armored vehicles moving into position, their lights off, but engines running hot. James felt the tactical situation shifting beneath his feet. They'd prepared for criminals, for corrupt local law enforcement, even for professional and contractors. But state police tactical teams, operating under seemingly legitimate orders. That changed everything. Emma, pull up the files we recovered from their scout. James's mind raced through options as his daughter accessed the encrypted data they'd taken from their first captive. Cross-reference with Williams's known associates. The results populated her screen within seconds, and Sarah gasped. The corruption went higher than they'd imagined. Property records, bank transfers, shell companies, all leading back to a state judge and several prominent business figures. The farm raids weren't just about creating trafficking routes, they were about systematically seizing strategic properties to build an empire. They're going to make it look like a standoff gone wrong, James concluded grimly. Use legitimate tactical teams to eliminate any witnesses, then blame it on armed resistance to a lawful police action. His expression hardened as he watched. More vehicles arrived through the thermal imaging. Williams knows enough about our capabilities to make that story believable. Sarah's voice came through their comms, steady despite the revelation. The first contractors are in position. They're setting up heavy weapons. James, those aren't police issue. They're not planning to take prisoners. Dad, Emma's voice cracked slightly as she processed new data. I'm picking up chatter. They're calling in helicopter support. Military surplus, coming in from a private airfield. Her screens showed the approaching aircraft's signature. 20 minutes out, max. The Morrison family had prepared for many scenarios, but this level of force, backed by seemingly legitimate authority, hadn't been one of them. James watched as more tactical teams moved into position, their movements showing professional training and coordination. Williams had turned their preparations against them, using his knowledge of their defenses to plan an overwhelming assault. Yet something didn't add up. Williams's tactical movements were too precise, his knowledge too specific. James stared at the footage of the deputy chief, noting details he'd missed before. The way he moved, the hand signals he used, the confident way he directed professional contractors. Emma, run Williams's name through your deepest search protocols. Focus on military records, specifically Special Operations units between 1990 and 2000. Emma's search took only moments, but the results changed everything. Dad, he was Delta Force, same unit as you, just different years. She looked up from her screen, eyes wide. He knows our playbook because it's his playbook too. The night suddenly felt colder as James absorbed this new information. They weren't just fighting corruption. They were facing someone who could anticipate their every move, who understood exactly what they were capable of. The betrayal wasn't just professional, it was personal. James moved through the hidden tunnel network beneath his farm, mind racing through countermeasures. Williams would know all the standard Delta Force protocols, which meant their carefully prepared defenses might now be liabilities. Time to go off script. Emma, initiate blackout protocol, he commanded, but with a twist, leave sections 3 and 7 powered, make it look like a partial failure. If Williams expected their standard operating procedures, they'd give him something different. Got it, Emma responded, her fingers dancing across the keyboard, making it seem like we're losing power grid control. She paused, then added, Dad, I can reprogram the irrigation systems to respond randomly instead of tactically. It'll look like we're getting desperate. Sarah's voice came through their comms, tense but controlled. The contractors are taking the bait. They're focusing their approach on the seemingly vulnerable sectors. She was watching from a hidden position in the grain storage complex, using the thermal imaging to track enemy movements. Williams will expect us to go dark and quiet, James explained as he moved through the tunnels. So we're going to get loud. He reached a junction where they'd stored emergency equipment, including some of Emma's experimental tech projects. Remember that sonic disruption system you were working on? The one you said was too obvious to use. Emma's voice carried a hint of excitement. The frequency modulators are still in place, but Dad, they're not properly tested. The effects could be unpredictable. Unpredictable is exactly what we need. James reached another storage cache, this one containing old farming equipment they'd modified. Williams knows Delta Force tactics. He doesn't know about your innovations. Sarah's sharp intake of breath came through the comms. Multiple teams moving in. James, they're using our own defense points against us. Williams must have mapped them during his visits. Let them, James replied, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. Emma, initialize your drone swarm. The sound of small motors filled the air as dozens of miniature drones, officially registered as agricultural monitoring devices, deployed from hidden locations across the farm. Emma had modified them far beyond their original specifications, adding thermal cameras, sonic emitters, and other less obvious capabilities. Drones online, Emma reported, running interference patterns. The contractors' communications are starting to break up. Her voice held a note of fierce satisfaction. Their encrypted channels are degrading. They're having to switch to open frequencies. James allowed himself a grim smile. Williams might know Delta Force procedures, but he didn't know about the technical genius of a teenager who'd spent years turning farming technology into defensive weapons. Sarah, status. Their formation is breaking down, she reported. The professional contractors are still coordinated, but the state police teams are getting confused. Their thermal imaging must be malfunctioning. They keep shooting at drone signatures. The farm had become a technological battleground. Emma's drones created false heat signatures, disrupted communications, and generally played havoc with the sophisticated equipment the attackers relied on. Modern tactical gear was heavily dependent on electronics, and every electronic system could be fooled. Multiple vehicles approaching from the south, Emma suddenly announced. Different signatures. Dad, I think these are actually DEA. Their communications don't match the corrupted channels. James processed this information quickly. Real federal agents were incoming, but they'd be walking into a firefight blind. Emma, can you get a secure burst transmission to them? Photos of Williams, the evidence we've gathered? Already packaging the data, she confirmed. But Dad, the helicopter is still incoming. 10 minutes out, Max. Time to change the playing. Feel completely, James decided. Emma, remember that project you were working on? The one with the agricultural growth lights? The ultra-bright LEDs? She paused, understanding dawning in her voice. Dad, if we trigger them all at once, every night vision system within half a mile will be completely overwhelmed, he finished. Williams is expecting Delta Force tactics. Let's show him what happens when you combine military experience with teenage ingenuity. Sarah's voice carried a smile. The LEDs are in position. On your mark. The pieces were in place. Williams and his contractors had brought overwhelming force and insider knowledge, but they were about to learn that the most dangerous weapon on this farm wasn't James's military training. It was his family's ability to improvise. The Morrison farm was about to become a symphony of synchronized chaos. James moved through the underground tunnel network, carefully checking each component of their final trap. Everything had to work in perfect coordination. Emma's tech, Sarah's precision, and his tactical experience combining into one devastating operation. Helicopter 5 minutes out, Emma reported from her command center. I'm picking up their weapons systems. Dad, it's a military surplus Black Hawk, thermal, imaging spotlight package, and what looks like door-mounted weapons. Williams isn't taking any chances, Sarah added, her position in the grain silo giving her a clear view of the approaching forces. Ground teams are setting up a classic Delta containment pattern. They're expecting us to go underground when the helicopter arrives. James checked his watch, mentally timing their countermeasures. That's exactly what we'll let them think. Emma, show me the farm grid. His daughter's main screen lit up with a detailed overlay of their property. Every irrigation line, every power conduit, every hidden defensive position was marked. But more importantly, it showed the elaborate network of technological traps they'd spent the last hour preparing. Phase 1 ready, Emma confirmed, her fingers moving across multiple keyboards. Agricultural drones are in position, running silent. Growth lights are charged to maximum. Sonic disruptors are calibrated. She paused, double-checking her systems. Dad, if we time this wrong... We won't, he assured her, recognizing the weight of responsibility on her young shoulders. Sarah, status of the federal agents? DEA teams holding position 2 miles out, she reported. They've received our evidence packet, but they're waiting for backup. They don't want to risk engaging. State police units without clear authorization. James nodded grimly. They were on their own for this part. Emma, initiate sequence 1. Across the farm, subtle changes began. The irrigation system started a barely noticeable buildup of pressure. Hidden tanks of agricultural chemicals, all harmless but thoroughly disorienting when combined, began cycling through their release valves. Emma's drone swarm moved into their final positions, each unit carrying a specially modified payload. Ground teams moving in, Sarah reported, her voice steady. Wait, Williams is changing their formation. He's not falling for the obvious trap points. Good, James replied, surprising both his wife and daughter. He's thinking like Delta, looking for the real threat behind the obvious one, which means he's moving them exactly where we want them, Emma finished, understanding dawning in her voice. Dad, you're using his experience against him. The pieces were falling into place. Williams would be looking for traditional Delta Force countermeasures, expecting James to think like the soldier he'd been. Instead, the farm had been rigged with innovations no military manual had ever seen. Helicopter entering final approach, Sarah reported. Ground teams all in position. They're good, really good, moving like they've trained together for years. Emma, signal status? Clean burst transmission ready for the DEA teams. All our evidence, plus live feeds, showing police corruption in action. The moment we trigger this, they'll have everything they need for a full federal response. James took a deep breath, mentally reviewing every component of their plan. The farm's defenses had been completely reconfigured in the past hour, transformed from military-grade security into something entirely unique. Every one of Williams's tactical assumptions was about to become a liability. Sarah, synchronize your shot clock. When the lights go, you'll have exactly 3 seconds before the chemical. Fog drops visibility to 0. Make them count. Already on target, she confirmed, the steel in her voice matching her steady hands on her rifle. These people threatened our home. Trust me, I won't miss. Emma, final checklist. His daughter's voice was confident as she ran through their preparations. Irrigation pressure at maximum, chemical dispersal units ready, drones swarm in attack formation, growth lights charged beyond recommended safety limits. Sonic disruptors tuned to Williams's expected frequency range. Emergency channels open to DEA teams. She paused, then added softly, Dad, we're about to turn our entire farm into one massive booby trap. No, James corrected her, pride mixing with grim determination. We're about to remind everyone why you don't threaten a family that combines Delta Force training with farming ingenuity and teenage technical genius. The helicopter's rotor wash was now visible in the wheat fields, creating patterns that would have been beautiful under other circumstances. Williams and his teams were in position, their trap seemingly ready to close. They had no idea they were the ones about to be trapped. The helicopter's searchlight cut through the darkness, sweeping across the Morrison farm in precise patterns. In the command center, Emma's screens showed the final positions of every player in this deadly game. Williams's teams had formed a perfect tactical net, exactly as James had predicted they would. All units in position, Sarah reported from her hidden perch. Through her scope, she could see Williams himself, directing operations from what he thought was a secure command post. They're waiting for the helicopter to get into position before they start their final push. James keyed his radio, knowing Williams would be listening. Last chance to pull back, John. He used Williams's first name deliberately, letting him know they'd discovered his identity. You taught these protocols yourself. You know how this ends. Williams's voice crackled over their captured frequencies, calm and professional. You're good, Morrison, maybe even as good as they say, but you're also outnumbered, outgunned, and about to be classified as a domestic terrorist. Stand down, and maybe your family makes it out alive. Emma's fingers flew across her keyboard, making final adjustments to their countermeasures. Helicopters at optimal position, she reported. Chain reaction ready on your mark. James felt time slow, that familiar combat clarity settling over him. Everything they'd prepared, every trap and contingency, was about to be triggered. There would be no going back from this moment. Sarah, designate your targets. Emma, initiate Protocol Omega. Across the farm, systems began powering up. The irrigation pressure meters climbed into the red. Agricultural chemical tanks hummed as their mixing cycles reached completion. Emma's drone swarm, hidden in the darkness, armed their specialized payload packages. They're starting to move, Sarah reported, her voice tight with tension. The thermal imaging showed Williams' teams beginning their advance, their formations perfect, their approach exactly by the book. 20 seconds to optimal range. Remember, James said quietly, knowing these might be his last words to his family for a while. Timing is everything. Trust your training. Trust each other. The helicopter made its final adjustment, positioning itself for maximum coverage. In the grain silo, Sarah's finger tightened on her trigger. In the command center, Emma's hand hovered over her master control. Key. 10 seconds, Sarah counted down. Williams's voice came over the radio again, supremely confident. Final warning, Morrison. You can't win this one. 5 seconds, Emma whispered. James thought of his peaceful farming life, of the dreams they'd built here, of the corruption that had forced them into this moment. His voice was steel when he gave the command, execute. The Morrison farm erupted into calculated mayhem. Every ultra-bright LED growth light ignited simultaneously, creating a blinding dome of white light that overwhelmed night vision equipment and weapon sights. The helicopter pilot, caught completely off guard, instinctively pulled up to avoid the sudden glare. That was only the beginning. Emma's drone swarm launched, each unit dispersing its payload of agricultural chemicals into carefully calculated patterns. The mixing compounds created a dense, disorienting fog that seemed to glow in the harsh LED light. At the same time, the irrigation system reached maximum pressure, turning selected sections of the farm into treacherous mud pits. Through it all, Sarah's rifle cracked 3 times in rapid succession. Even in the chaos, her shots found their marks with surgical precision. 3 of Williams's key team leaders went down, their weapons disabled, their bodies intact, but their fight finished. Second phase, James commanded, already moving through. The underground tunnels. The sonic disruptors activated, broadcasting frequencies that played havoc with tactical communications and inner ear function. Williams's perfect formation began to break apart as his teams lost coordination, but Williams himself remained dangerous. Through the confusion, James could hear him shouting new orders, adapting to the chaos, proving why he'd been Delta Force. Push through it. They're trying to split our attention. Primary teams converge on the house. Air support, find me a clear shot. It was exactly the response James had predicted. Exactly what they'd prepared for. Emma, he said softly into his comm, show them what happens when you threaten a farmer's daughter who studies agricultural engineering. His daughter's voice was pure steel when she replied, initiating endgame, Dad. May God have mercy on their souls, because our farm sure won't. The real trap was about to be sprung. The Morrison farm transformed into a battlefield, unlike anything Williams or his contractors had ever faced. Emma's modified agricultural drones swarmed through the chemical fog, their infrared strobes creating ghost images that confused thermal scopes and targeting systems. The helicopter pilot struggled to maintain position as conflicting sensor data flooded his instruments. Delta Team compromised, one of Williams's commanders shouted over their command net. Can't maintain formation in this mud. What the hell is that noise? The sonic disruptors were doing their job, creating frequencies that disrupted both communication and equilibrium. James moved like a shadow through his prepared routes, engaging targets with precise efficiency. Each shot was carefully placed, disabling weapons, inflicting painful but non-lethal wounds. This wasn't about killing. This was about dismantling an operation piece by piece. Dad, Williams is adapting. Emma warned through the comm. He's switching to old-school hand signals, trying to reorganize his teams into a tighter formation. Her fingers flew across her keyboard, adjusting their countermeasures. But that's putting them right in the path of execute phase 3, James commanded. Across the farm, hidden sprayers activated, dispensing a mixture of agricultural chemicals that Emma had specially formulated. The combination was harmless, but devastating to tactical equipment. Weapon actions began to jam. Radio frequencies deteriorated further. Even protective gear started to malfunction as chemical residue played havoc with seals and filters. Sarah's voice came through their secure channel, calm and focused. 6 more targets neutralized. They're bunching up near the equipment shed, trying to use it for cover. There was a pause. Then, James. Williams is moving toward the house. He's figured out where Emma's command center is. James felt his heart rate spike, but his voice remained steady. "Emma, protocol zenith now!" His daughter's response was immediate. The farm's entire electrical grid surged, sending carefully calculated power spikes through hidden conduits. Equipment shed lights exploded in showers of sparks. The helicopter's instruments went haywire as electromagnetic pulses disrupted its systems. "What the hell are you using, Morrison?" William's voice crackled through their captured frequencies. "This isn't Delta tactics. This isn't even military." "You're right," James replied, moving to intercept William's approach to the house. "This is what happens when you combine military experience with a farming family's ingenuity. And you threatened the wrong family." The helicopter pilot finally lost his battle with the farm's defenses. Between the chemical fog, electromagnetic interference, and Emma's drone swarm, staying airborne became impossible. The aircraft retreated, its weapon systems useless, its tactical advantage nullified. "Multiple vehicles approaching from the south," Emma reported. "DEA tactical teams moving fast. They've got our evidence transmission. They're coming in hot." Williams must have heard the same reports. His voice came through again, tension finally showing. "Morrison, your family's still in there. We can still end this without..." His words cut off as Sarah's rifle cracked again. The shot was perfect, destroying the tactical radio in Williams's hand without breaking skin. "That's for threatening my daughter," she said coldly, cycling her bolt for another round. The farm had become Williams's worst nightmare. Every advantage his teams had relied on was turned against them. Night vision was worse than useless in the strobing lights and chemical fog. Thermal imaging showed dozens of false targets from Emma's drones. Communications were breaking down, equipment was failing, and the terrain itself seemed to fight against them. "Federal agents moving into position," Emma reported. Wait, Dad, Williams is making a final push. 3 teams converging on the house. They're going to try to breach before the DEA arrives." James was already moving. "Sarah, covering. Via Emma, initiate the Hades protocol." The farm's final defense activated. Every irrigation line reached maximum pressure simultaneously, turning the entrance points around the house into a quagmire. Hidden tanks released their last mixture of chemicals, creating a fog bank so dense it was like swimming through cotton. The sonic disruptors reached frequencies that made standing nearly impossible. Through it all, James closed in on Williams. Both men had trained in the same unit, learned the same tactics, but James was fighting for more than a mission. He was fighting for his family, his home, everything he'd built. The 2 Delta Force veterans met in combat amid the chaos they'd created. Williams was good, his strikes precise, his movement efficient. But James had something Williams had. Forgotten, a reason to fight that went beyond money or power. The battle was brief but intense. Every trick, every counter, every move, honed by years of special operations training, came into play. But in the end, it wasn't military training that decided the fight. It was a simple farming tool, a length of irrigation pipe, repurposed as a weapon by a man who'd learned to adapt military skills to agricultural life. Williams went down, unconscious but alive, just as the first DEA vehicles breached the farm's perimeter. Their tactical teams moved in, weapons ready, only to find most of the threat already neutralized. Professional contractors lay scattered across the property, disabled by a combination of precision shooting and agricultural ingenuity. State police teams sat in their vehicles, unable to fight through the technical and environmental hell the Morrison family had created. "Farm is secure," Sarah reported from her position. "DEA teams are taking Williams into custody." "They look confused about what exactly happened here." Emma's voice carried exhausted pride. "Dad, you should see their faces. These tactical teams can't figure out how their entire operation got taken down by a farmer and his family." James moved to retrieve his daughter from the command center, every muscle aching, but his mind finally at peace. "Let's show them," he said quietly. Let's show them exactly what happens when you threaten a family that knows how to combine Delta Force. Training with farming wisdom and teenage tech genius, the morning sun began to rise over the Morrison farm, revealing the full extent of their defense. Federal agents stared in amazement at the sophisticated integration of agricultural equipment and military tactics. And at the center of it all, a family stood united, having protected not just their home, but exposed a corruption that had threatened their entire community. They had done the impossible. They had won. The weeks following the siege of Morrison Farm brought changes nobody could have predicted. Federal investigations swept through the county like a cleansing fire, exposing corruption at every level. Williams's network crumbled as evidence from Emma's data collection revealed the full scope of their operation. Farms that had been seized were returned to their rightful owners, though many would bear the scars of violence for years to come. James stood in his wheat fields, watching the morning sun paint the stalks golden. The damage from the battle had largely been repaired, irrigation lines replaced, chemical residue cleaned up, equipment restored. But the farm felt different now. Every feature that had served as a weapon or defense point held new meaning, telling a story of how a family had stood against overwhelming odds. Sarah joined him, slipping her hand into his. She'd been busy helping other farming families recover, her quiet strength becoming a rallying point for the community. "The Sullivan kids are coming over later," she said softly. "Mary wants Emma to teach them about setting up security systems. Seems everyone wants to learn from the family that outfought a private army." Emma's reputation had grown in unexpected ways. Her innovative use of agricultural technology had caught the attention of several universities. She'd received early acceptance letters from top engineering programs, along with some interesting offers from federal agencies. But for now, she was content to help rebuild her community, teaching other farmers how to protect themselves. "Agent Phillips called," Sarah continued, referring to the DEA team leader who'd arrived that night. "The last of Williams's state-level conspirators were arrested this morning. It's really over," James nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon out of habit. Some instincts never faded. "Not over," he corrected gently. "Just changing, like the seasons, like the crops. We adapt, we grow, we get stronger." The sound of Emma's voice carried from the barn where she was installing upgraded monitoring systems. She was laughing with the local kids, teaching them how to distinguish between normal and suspicious activity on their farms. The future law enforcement officers of their community were learning from a teenager who'd helped expose corruption in their own ranks. "You know," Sarah mused, "when we bought this farm, I thought we were leaving the fighting behind. Turns out we were just learning new ways to fight for what matters." James pulled her close, remembering the choices that had brought them here. "We built something worth fighting for. Not just the farm, the life, the community, the future." He gestured toward the barn where Emma's impromptu security class was in full swing. "That's the real harvest. Not what we grow in these fields, but what we've grown in our hearts." The distant sound of vehicles approaching made them both tense. For a moment before recognizing the familiar engines, more neighbors arriving, bringing food for the community gathering that had become a weekly tradition. Farmers supporting farmers, stronger together than alone. Their farm had become more than just a homestead. It was a symbol of resistance against corruption, a testament to the power of family, and a reminder that sometimes the most effective warriors are those who know how to blend military precision with agricultural wisdom and youthful innovation. Cuck. Wheat fields swayed in the morning breeze, hiding their defensive modifications beneath the peaceful golden waves. The Morrison farm would always be ready, always vigilant, but now it protected more than just their family. It stood as a beacon of hope for their entire community. James smiled as Emma's latest security drone buzzed overhead, running its morning patrol. Some might see their continued vigilance as paranoia, but he knew better. Peace wasn't just the absence of conflict, it was the presence of justice, preparedness, and the willingness to stand together against any threat. The war for Morrison Farm was over. The legacy of what they'd built here was just beginning.